We are in chapter 4. We've been kind of rolling through the Bible here slowly. Let's talk about 1 Kings. First of all, there is no division in the book of Kings and 1 Kings and 2 Kings. In the Hebrew Bible, it's just one book. But in tradition of how they've added verses and chapters to help us in studying, it has been split out to 1 Kings, 2 Kings. 1 Kings being basically the rise of the kingdom of Israel, and 2 Kings is like the bad news part. So 1 Kings is, hey, this is good stuff. 2 Kings is like, yeah, not so good, because people are there. People are sinful, and all the warnings that God gave them about their kings. If you get a king, he's going to tax you right out of your wallet. Your life's not going to be as good as you think. And they said, oh, nevertheless, we got to have a king. So they went and Samuel gave him Saul. Saul kind of fell apart, and God chose David. And now we're at the end of David's life. He is pretty well croaked. Solomon has taken over. He was the anointed one. And we learn an awful lot, don't we, about David. We learn an awful lot about Solomon. We learn an awful lot about human nature. And the Bible doesn't sugarcoat anything, does it? We see the good, we see the bad, we see the ugly. And so now what we're going to see is this is how it happened. And a lot of it we saw earlier when God would warn them, if you do this, this is going to happen. They didn't do this, so this happened. And that's pretty much what we're going to be seeing here pretty soon. Steve asked me how I'm going to pull off chapter 4 has all these names. I figured I'd let a British narrator pull this off. So has everyone got their Bibles open to 1 Kings chapter 4? Here we go.
The book of 1 Kings chapter 1. When King David was very old, he could not keep warm even when they put covers over him.
Time out.
So,
here we go.
1 Kings 4. So King Solomon ruled over all Israel, and these were his chief officials: Azariah, son of Zadok the priest, Elihoreph and Ahijah, sons of Shisha, secretaries, Jehoshaphat, son of Ahilud, recorder, Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, commander-in-chief, Zadok and Abiathar, priests, Azariah, son of Nathan, in charge of the district governors, Zabud, son of Nathan, a priest and advisor to the king, Ahishar, palace administrator, Adoniram, son of Abda, in charge of forced labor. Solomon had 12 district governors over all Israel, who supplied provisions for the king and the royal household. Each one had to provide supplies for 1 month in the year. These are their names: Ben-Hur, in the hill country of Ephraim; Ben-Decker, in Makaz; Shalbim, Beth-Shemesh, and Elon, Beth-Hanan; Ben-Hesed, in Arabath. Soko and all the land of Hepher were his. Ben-Abinadab, in Naphoth Dor, he was married to Taphath, daughter of Solomon. Banah, son of Ahilud, in Tanakh and Megiddo, and in all of Bethshan, next to Zarathan, below Jezreel, from Bethshan to Abel Meholah, across to Jokneam. Ben-Geber, in Ramoth Gilead. The settlements of Jair, son of Manasseh, and Gilead were his, as well as the region of Argob and Bashan, and its 60 large walled cities with bronze gate bars. Ahinadab, son of Edo, in Mahanaim; Ahimaaz, in Naphtali. He had married Basemath, daughter of Solomon; Banah, son of Hushai, in Asher and in Aloth; Jehoshaphat, son of Paruah, in Issachar; Shimei, son of Elah, in Benjamin; Geber, son of Uri, in Gilead, the country of Sihon, king of the Amorites, and the country of Og, king of Bashan. He was the only governor over the district.
Okay. I did a good job reading that, didn't I? There you go. I appreciate that. Why is all this in here? Well, in addition to, we could take each name and tell you exactly what the Bible says and what we know from history of each of these people. A couple of them that interest me is Zadok the priest. Do you remember him? Whenever they do the coronation, they just did the coronation of Charles. They play the big song is Zadok the priest. And the coronation of Solomon, coronation of Charles. They try to show it's all because of God, God coronating the king. Well, Nathan and Zadok the priest were the ones that coronated Solomon. So that caught my eye right away. A couple of these other people, if you look closely, Benai, son of Jehoiada, commander-in-chief. This is the guy when Solomon said, I want you to take care of my enemies. He went straight to him and cut him up, took care of the business. So he was one that was mentioned in earlier chapters in 1 King. If you look closely, though, I looked at about half of these closely, you'll find out that they either worked for David and were trusted, or they were faithful to Solomon when David's son tried to take over, when Abijah tried to go in and steal the throne. So that's what you see here is Solomon is rewarding those that were loyal to him, which is something you see today when presidents have their cabinet and that sort of thing. At least they should. Now comes the good stuff in chapter 4, verses 20 through 34.
The people of Judah and Israel were as numerous as the sand on the seashore. They ate, they drank, and they were happy. And Solomon ruled over all the kingdoms from the Euphrates River to the land of the Philistines as far as the border of Egypt. These countries brought tribute and were Solomon's subjects all his life. Solomon's daily provisions were 30 cores of the finest flour and 60 cores of meal, 10 head of stall-fed cattle, 20 of pasture-fed cattle, and 100 sheep and goats, as well as deer, gazelle, roebucks, and choice fowl. For he ruled over all the kingdoms west of the Euphrates River, from Tifsa to Gaza, and had peace on all sides. During Solomon's lifetime, Judah and Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, lived in safety, everyone under their own vine and under their own fig tree. Solomon had 4,000 stalls for chariot horses and 12,000 horses. The district governors, each in his month, supplied provisions for King Solomon and all who came to the king's table. They saw to it that nothing was lacking. They also brought to the proper place their quotas of barley and straw for the chariot horses and the other horses. God gave Solomon wisdom and very great insight. And
we'll stop real quick there. In addition to these being the people that were in his cabinet, if you will, or his advisors, we find out that Solomon had it pretty good. He set it up in such a way and organized his government in such a way that people were in charge of bringing in all the product and provisions that were needed for the people that ate with him. Plus he had just a few horses, didn't he? Just a couple. Why would he need so many food items, and why would he need so many horses, do you suppose? Okay, he had to feed his posse, so he had to get all these people food. All the horses had to be fed, all the soldiers had to be fed. Why would you need to have a lot of soldiers and horses? Protect your kingdom, right? War, okay? And he says, he calls them chariot horses and other horses. What other horses would there be? Horses that pull chariots and other horses. War horses, okay? What's a war horse? I mean, we've heard that term, someone's called a war horse. They would train these animals to go into battle. Just go in and start kicking and thrashing, and moving their hooves around. They'd put sharp hooves on them. They'd put spikes and everything else. And you could just tear into the enemy like crazy if you had trained war horses. But they were so into it that they had to literally pull the horses out of battle after so long, or else they would just fight till they died. So you had to have more horses to come in as reserves while you rested some. So when it says that he's got 12,000 war horses, or horses, not only does he need to pull people around for various government duties, sort of like the carpool of today for the government. In addition to that, he'd have to have war horses that you could put into battle and pull out. And just the threat of that many war horses and chariots probably is why he had 40 years of peace.
I kind of broke a few of these numbers down.
Okay?
And then interesting, this is the food on a daily basis. Basically, on the fine flour and meal, it came out to, using a 55-gallon barrel, came out to 245 barrels of meal and flour. On the cattle alone, not counting the other meat, they came out to 13,200 pounds of meat per day.
Yikes.
And that's to feed.
That's amazing. That is a ton of food. And of course, they didn't have refrigeration, so you either had to immediately salt it, brine it, whatever, or serve it. And that's what they did. They served it. So butchered it, served it. Tons and tons of food. And these people were happy to do it. And you say, how do I know that they were happy to do it? It says so. Let's see here. Verse 20. People of Judah and Israel were as numerous as the sand of the seashore. They ate and they drank and they were happy. Okay? 40 years of peace. I cannot imagine 40 years of peace. But they had it. All right, now we're back to the text.
And a breadth of understanding as measureless as the sand on the seashore.
Verse
Solomon's
30.
wisdom was greater than the wisdom of all the people of the East, and greater than all the wisdom of Egypt. He was wiser than anyone else, including Ethan the Ezrahite, wiser than Heman, Calcol, and Darda, the sons of Mahol, and his fame spread to all the surrounding nations. He spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs numbered 1,005. He spoke about plant life, from the cedar of Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of walls. He also spoke about animals and birds, reptiles and fish. From all nations, people came to listen to Solomon's wisdom, sent by all the kings of the world who had heard of his wisdom.
Okay, and that ends chapter 4. There's quite a bit of meat in here, and the time we have, I just want to take into account a few of these items. The first thing I want to point out is the wisdom. He was talking about the wisdom of Solomon, and one of the class questions is compare Solomon's wisdom to everyone else's. Far and above anyone around before or since, right? I struggle a little bit with the word wisdom in that if he was so wise, why did he get distracted at the end of his life, right? He got distracted, if you didn't know, at the end of his life, King Solomon, with all that wisdom and knowledge, by his wives and his concubines, and they distracted him, got him to worship other idols. There is no other God, so basically idols, and abominable practices that they had in those worships. And he was able to be distracted enough that he forgot his first love. And then how is that wisdom? You know, I've always struggled with that thought. Then it dawned on me, and I also read a few things. If you go back to chapter 3 of 1 Kings, God came to Solomon 3 times. The first time he came as a young man in a dream, and he said, "You are now in charge of my people. Ask anything you will, and I'll give it to you." And in his first vision, being the immature, if you will, and innocent young man, he said, "Give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people, to help distinguish right from wrong and be able to govern this great people of yours." So that was what he asked for in his first visit with God, first of 3. And does that sound like a good thing to ask for? Absolutely. God was pleased. But if you notice, he did not say, "Give me wisdom as it applies to pleasing you." It was all about governing and being able to rightly discern right and wrong if he had to make a judgment. So I think you pretty much get what you ask for sometimes in life. What do you pray for? You know, you might think about that just a little bit and open up the depths of your request to say, "Lord, help me to realize what I need to pray for and to ask for those things that are most important." You know, God was pleased that he didn't ask for wealth and fame and things of that nature or the death of his enemies. But at the same point, everlasting, are we going to see Solomon in heaven? And I think the answer is no, I don't think so. And so he was led astray, and I think it all goes back to being a young man and what he asked for. And while it was a great thing to ask for, I think he could have gone just a little bit further and said, "And also be able to please you." Okay? And I think back to my prayers, and I think about my lifetime. I'm only 64 now, so I've got another 100 to go. But so far, I've been able to see quite a few things. And one thing for sure is I'm glad that God hasn't given me everything I've asked for. Now, I don't know how you feel about it, but God's unanswered prayers, just like the Garth Brooks song, pretty deep thought, you know, that you didn't get everything you asked for. But if Solomon had asked for wisdom to please God, I don't think that his life would have turned out like it did. Was he able to, by the way, discern right from wrong as a judge, as a king? We hear the story about cutting the baby in half. You've heard that story. We've already covered that. We've heard how well he could organize the country. His border went all the way up to the Euphrates River, all the way down to Egypt. Everyone in there paid tribute. There was peace for 40 years. So God definitely gave him wisdom. In addition, it pleased him to ask for that. So God gave him knowledge about everything under the sun. And can you imagine sitting and listening to that lecture? I want to talk to you about lizards today. And he would have gotten into some things that even biologists today wouldn't know. He would have, people were spellbound by what he was able to say because his knowledge came directly from God. It would have been like watching David Attenborough on, PBS, when they show him and you watch the nature of God and what he built. To be able to hear Solomon talk would have really been something. Let's see here in verse 20 where it gets interesting for us. I want you to notice something here. One of the questions is how many people were in Judah and Israel, verse 20? Bunch. As numerous as what? People were as numerous as grains of sand on the seashore. Okay, does that sound familiar, that term? Okay. Earlier in class, we were studying Abraham. So turn back to Genesis 22. Genesis 22, verse 15. The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, and he's talking about God told him to sacrifice Isaac, if you remember. So he's taken Isaac up to the hill of what is now Jerusalem, and he's ready to sacrifice Isaac, and the angel stopped him. He says, But because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as what? As sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all nations on the earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me. So when you go back to this promise made to Abraham, over here in 1 Kings chapter 4, we see that it's been fulfilled. At least this portion of that promise. The first portion is that he's going to have descendants. If you remember that story, the angel came and talked to him and Sarah, or Sarah overheard it. He says, well, I'm going to give you a son, or I'm going to give you descendants. And Sarah laughed, remember? You know, I'm old. I can't see this happening, you know. And sure enough, 25 years later, that's a long time to wait. 25 years later, they have Isaac. All right. Now, the second part of this promise is that I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as sand on the seashore. How many years did that take? Well, I got out my abacus. 1,200 years. So it took 25 years to get Isaac, took 1,200 years to get the descendants, you know, to be as numerous as the sand on the seashore, and all the people, you know, to be taken advantage of, all their enemies. And by the way, they came into Canaan. I always worried about, why did they kill all these Canaanites? What did they do? Well, when you read the text, you find out they deserved to be killed. They were going against God. They knew who God was. They were going against God, and they were receiving God's judgment. They weren't just killing because God was bloodlusty. These nations were killing their babies in worship of their gods. They were horrible people. And when God sent in his nation, he wanted to wipe these people out as retribution for their sin, just like he did Sodom and Gomorrah. But, of course, they messed up, had to wander through the desert for 40 years, and then go back in and take it. So they took the land. They were as numerous as the sand on the seashore. The third part of Abraham's promise was that through your seed all nations shall be blessed. Has that happened yet in 1 Kings? No, because that's the promise of Jesus, being able to bless all nations. So that's going to happen in another 1,000 years. So 25 years to get Isaac, 1,200 years to be numerous as the sand on the shore, another 1,000 years to bless all nations. So that's the way God operates. And sometimes we pray, and what do we want? We want an end to the Ukrainian war tomorrow. We pray and we want our leg healed tomorrow. That isn't how God works. He doesn't think that way. And he doesn't work that way. And a lot of times he disappoints us with his timetable, doesn't he? But that's how God works, and that's how his timetable is. Sometimes a day is like 1,000 years. But did he answer the promise? In all three cases of that, 3 phases of that promise, yes.
In those 1,200 years, that basically represented 30 generations. Based on your age, you've been around for 3 generations, and look at what has changed, and of course, that our nation and the world has taken in 3 generations. Imagine 30 generations, 10%. It's amazing.
It is amazing. And hopefully the world will last another. It's God's will that all should come to repentance. And so at some point, though, I think he's going to pull the lever. Let's talk about the other 2 times that Solomon was visited by God. Do you remember what those were? He did visit Solomon when he was a young man. He gave him the opportunity to pick and choose what he would like to have from God, and he asked for a wise and discerning heart. The other 2 times, do you remember? The other 2 times were God comes and says, hey, you've got all this going for you now. Choose to follow my ways. And he gave him that opportunity. So he had a second opportunity to speak with God, or to be in presence of God in a dream, and basically was given that opportunity to remember what he really ought to be doing in life. And did he pull that off? The answer is no. He did not pull that off. He let his wife lead him astray. And that was what the third visit was, is when basically God said, you screwed up. You were told, you were given the chance to correct things, and now the judgment is placed. Your kingdom's going to come out of your hands. But for your sake of your father David, who followed me with his heart, I'm not going to do it in your lifetime. And as soon as Solomon died, we know the story about Rehoboam and so forth, and the kingdom divides, and then it goes downhill from there. So that was the third time that God visited Solomon. There was something else I wanted to say about that. Now I can't remember what it was. I had it tattooed on my brain, but I can't remember it at the moment. The questions, though, that we were asked to bring up in class, first of all, was, how long was Solomon's reign? How long did Solomon sit on the throne? 40 years. All right, so that was a very long time. If he started when he was about 20 years old, he lived to be in his 60s or 70s. And the people were what? Verse 20. They were very contented. They ate, they drank, they were happy. Everyone sat under their own fig tree. They basically had life good, didn't they? And this is what they always look back to the rest of their history is, man, if we could just get back to Solomon's days. Okay, how high were the borders of Israel at that time? How low? What was the extent of the kingdom? From the south, they were bordered by Egypt, and at the north, their boundary was the Euphrates River. So, is that Iran or is that Iraq today? I can't remember. But all the way from the Euphrates River down to Egypt, and of course, Egypt was scared of them. They didn't attack during that 40 years. Later on, Egypt would attack Israel and take all their gold out of their temple. And it was done because God wanted to punish Israel. When was Kings written? First and Second Kings. Anyone know? And who wrote it? Well, let's just run down the normal suspect. Could Moses have written? No, he was dead. Okay. Would Solomon have written it? A little hard to write back about the end of his life if it was Solomon. So it probably wasn't Solomon. The long answer is no one knows. But most likely it was written when they were in captivity. If you keep following through Kings, you find out that Israel is carted off. They're carted off to Babylonian captivity. And most likely this set of writings was done when they were in captivity, probably by one of the prophets. I think the Jews consider it written by trying to think which prophet, which was the prophet back then that was Jeremiah. Thank you. It slipped my mind there. It was written by, they would attribute it to Jeremiah, and he would be a good person to have written it because he would be well aware. And it's interesting as you go into the further classes how whoever wrote this, it's probably Jeremiah, but as he writes along, he'll stop and he'll say, "Are not these written in the annals of the kings?" And these are books that are long gone now, and we don't have record of. But he makes reference to them, which means that at the time they were common knowledge. And that little phrase always catches my attention. Well, why don't we have those? That would be fun to have all this stuff. But I guess it's like John said, if we have everything written that could be written, it would take, we could use all the water in the ocean as ink, we still would have stuff to write. Yeah. Yes, he's talking about, for those that may be watching online, Steve Smith was saying, that sometimes you read in the passages that this pile of stones, this marker is here still to this day, to the time that they wrote that. And it's interesting to me in the last 20 years how people have actually gone in search of these things that are supposedly still there. And in many cases, they're still there. Later on in Kings, we talk about the prophets of Baal being killed. Was that Elijah? Okay, so Elijah brings out the prophets of Baal, and they have this big contest on the mountain. And today, if you go to that spot, you can go to that spot, there still is basically rubble from what could be an altar. I mean, there's things like that are still actually there, And me and Mark have talked before about the wanderings of the Israelites, and some people believe that the split rock and so forth still exist, and there is still split rocks. It looks like water came out of it. Is it actually? We don't know. I think if we actually knew this was the place where Moses struck the rock and water came out, that people would go there and worship it. So I think God purposely leaves little ambiguity to these things. But it's fun to see. Certainly you won't find anything in archaeology that will deny anything you find in the Bible. But they certainly do enhance. And a lot of these markers that are here to this day that are mentioned in the Bible, some of them, there's one place where the Israelites stopped and they built an altar with 12 uncut stones. And if you go there, there's 12 uncut stones. And it's like, So it's very interesting, yeah. So a very interesting section on God's people, and in particular, the answer to Abraham's, a portion of Abraham's promise is fulfilled and mentioned here. Also, we're seeing how outrageously wealthy Solomon is, and how he has unbelievably organized his country. Huge amounts of what would you call that? Not infrastructure, but just logistics. Just logistics were just unbelievable, unmatched. His wisdom was unmatched by anyone else ever, before or since, in terms of knowledge of how to rule and organize. Next week, we're going to be getting into chapter 5, which is really interesting, which is the building of the temple. So we'll leave it at that. I appreciate your time. You like my reading? I pulled this off pretty good, didn't I?